Hi, I'm Caroline Levitt. I'm the co-founder of A Mighty Blaze, the book initiative that started at the beginning of the pandemic to help the independent bookstores whose stores were shuttered, to help all authors like myself whose tours were canceled, and also to help readers and to build up some kind of a community. This is an absolutely exciting event because we have one of my favorite writers of all times. I've been following her work since her very first book, Mona Simpson. Mona Simpson's new book is called Commitment. And I was talking to Mona about it beforehand, about how astonishing it is and how personal and how amazing. It's about one woman, Diana Z's, a single mother who, like most mother, yearns for her kids to have everything she didn't, who has a mental collapse and winds up in a psychiatric hospital in the 1970s. This impacts her three children as they struggle into young adulthood. Her son, Walter, discovers a passion for architecture, even as he starts questioning his motives for what he's doing in life and if it has a future. His sister Lena is an artist who's also wondering about what is the meaning of art given what's happening with their mother. And then finally, there's Donnie, the little brother who begins to drift towards drugs and a life on a beach until he comes through. So before I ask Mona questions, I want to tell you a little bit about her. She won a Whiting Award for her first novel, Anywhere But Here, which is, just a brilliant genius novel. It was a critical success, adapted as a film, and which was released in 1999. She wrote a sequel, The Lost Father. Critical recognition has included the Chicago Tribune, Heartland Prize, and she made the shortlist for the Penn Faulkner Award for her novel Off Keck Road, which I also loved. She's also the author of the critically acclaimed My Hollywood and Case book. Wakey Wynn, author of Joan is Okay, says of Commitment, this is a sweeping family epic that took me from one American coast to another. Simpson is so attuned to the family heart. The Washington Post called it a masterpiece. The San Francisco Chronicle said acclaimed novelist Simpson's latest is a vast and multifaceted tale of one family's mutual dedication and loyalty that powerfully demonstrate the importance of community. So it's all those things. It's all those things. So I wanted to ask you about, first I wanted to ask, well, first, welcome, Mona. Thank you so much for being here. I wanted to ask about the mother-child relationships in the novel. First of all, because when I first read Anywhere But Here, there's a last line from the mother that says, "You were the reason I was born." And when I first read it, I thought, oh, that's such a wonderful thing to say to your child. And then the more I thought about it, I thought, that's a big responsibility to put on a child, to tell a child that they are the reason you were born. There's so much to unpack about that. And when I started reading Commitment, there's so much to unpack about how these three siblings felt about their mother before she was in the hospital, and how it made them change about how they felt about themselves and each other, and how they felt about her towards the end, because there were a lot of feelings of relief, wanting to pull away, wanting to come closer. Could you just talk about that a little?
Sure. It's funny. The mother is at the center of the novel, but she doesn't really have a voice. She's not.
Yes.
So she's kind of the mysterious center of it. And each of them at different times kind of contends with basically their what this will mean for them for the rest of their lives. What they will do about it. And the first person who's really impacted is the oldest son, Walter, who's always
Right.
felt a little bit like the head of the family, the man of the family. The father is mostly out of the picture, not useful. And he's going, and right at the beginning of the novel, he goes off to college. So he feels
Right.
nervous anyway, and a little bit responsible, and worries about his family at home. He knows his mother has a certain fragility, and he feels he's sort of the pin that keeps it. Not that he does anything specific, but he feels that his presence in the family is sort of essential, which I think a lot of people feel, but most kids go to college and are probably a little relieved and a little insulted that the family goes on quite well without them. But that doesn't happen here. And in fact, she does have a fall, and he really comes to terms with that in a deep way. I think he's the first to realize that they first think that she's going to be in the hospital for a little while, and then he talks to the doctor, and something the doctor says seems to him to imply that it'll be a year, not a matter of months, but maybe a year. So he's sort of counting down a year, and then right before the year is up, things get a little worse, and he realizes it won't be a year. And in fact, not only does he not know how long she'll be there, but the doctor doesn't even know that really the illness is following its own course, and he won't be able to predict it. Then Lena, I think with Lena later on, the daughter in the middle, who all along is sort of struggling to not be her mother, but also feels incredibly close to her mother.
Right.
And also is afraid in the way that her older brother isn't, that perhaps whatever illness her mother has inside her is also in Lena, and that it will come out in her later. And I don't know, one of the things I think about is after the mother's been in the hospital for a while, Lena has a date with a man she really likes, and she's very serious about already. From the first time she went out with him, she sort of feels like, oh, this is what people have been talking about in the books and the movies. But then after a couple of dates, on one date, he asks about her family, and she has to tell him the truth, which is
right.
really hard to explain. And she is trying to sort of do this in a way that seems honest and straightforward. And then the youngest son has
Donnie
has always had a sort of easy closeness with his mother, which he somehow retains even after she's in the hospital. He keeps visiting her, and he ends up being the person in young adulthood who spends the most of the three, who spends the most time with her.
I wanted to also ask about Julie, who's this incredible character. She's a best friend of Diane, the mother, and their lives just intersect until Diane actually becomes Julie's purpose. But Julie is also the one steadfast constant in these kids' life. And I wanted to know, where did this character come from, and why did you insert her in this family drama? I'm glad that you did. I just want to know why.
I wanted her drama to be sort of, I thought of them as having an important but uneven friendship, balanced friendship. I think in some ways it was a kind of romantic friendship in a certain way, the way we all have romantic friendships. But for me, I think Diane was sort of the romantic, protagonist in their friendship. She was the one who dragged them out into adventures and had a sense of fun and perhaps ambition and daring and style that Julie did not as much. And Julie was the stable person. They both went to nursing school together.
Right.
Nurses together. They worked together in a similar. They worked as nurses in home health, and so they were close. And I think Julie always was a little bit careful with Diane because she knew Diane had the kids. Diane was dating. Diane had a bigger life than she did. But then when this calamity happens, Julie both initially sort of rushes in to help the kids for the sake of Diane, for her friend, with whom she's a little bit in love too. I mean, she's always been not even clear probably entirely to herself. But she starts out by really just trying to help Diane by filling in the gaps with these kids. I mean, they lived with their mom in a rented house with a boarder as well. But the boarder doesn't want to be, the boarder is a young actress, this aspiring actress, and she doesn't want to be responsible for these kids. So Julie has to sort of be there every night for a little bit she needs to be there for a couple hours to sort of make sure that they don't have to leave their home. And she gradually fills in more and more because she begins, keeping up the bills and making sure that there's some food on the table. And eventually they even move in with her, the two who are left. So she starts out doing this just for her dear friend, and that's a large part of it. But then she's never had children. She never was married or wanted children. But once she's taking care of these kids, of course, they become meaningful to her, and she forms a real relationship with them, especially with the youngest son, who's able almost from the
Right.
get to love her.
They become a kind of family with Julie,
Mhm.
which was so moving. So the way that we treat mental disorders today is so much different than the way it was treated in the 1970s. I was fascinated by, you started to talk about Thomas Story Kirkbride, who was a Quaker psychiatrist, and his beliefs about what would cure patients. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I mean, it's funny to say he was a psychiatrist. He was one of the people who brought psychiatry into being a medical profession, into the medical profession. It used to be that people who ran asylums were called superintendents, and they were sort of like the administrator almost for the asylum. It's funny, since publishing this book, somebody wrote me a reader read about it or read it and sent me a book that he'd written, and it chronicles the history of medicine in Wisconsin. And part of it was that, in, before the turn of the century, there were some instances where a person would apprentice themselves to a doctor, and that's how they became a doctor. So we're talking about the very beginnings of psychiatry. There was a movement in Europe started in there were doctors in France and another doctor sort of around the same time in Italy, and then some Quakers in England, all who started a sort of a movement of gentler, kinder treatment towards mental illness. And they formulated something called moral treatment, which involved, getting patients in a small community out in nature, having some meaningful work, usually agricultural or gardening in nature, um, music, arts, a gentle kind of therapy. And they believed that that would formulate a cure. And so that was sort of the opening philosophy that was then brought over to the United States by certain, pioneers in this field. And Kirkbride was certainly one of them. He actually was unique in that he had a talent and an interest in sort of architecture. So he drew these facilities and made sort of a blueprint, which became the blueprint for all the big state mental health hospitals throughout the country. And of course, since this was America and they were being built at the end of the last century, and the beginning of the end of the 19th century, and the beginning of the 20th century, everything was bigger and newer, and these were very opulent structures. Some of them, they had pavilions for orchestras, they had art rooms, they had libraries, they had, he carefully planned the vistas out the windows, and they were formed as a sort of wing-like structure. So the very illest patients would be on the side corridors, so their noises wouldn't disturb people, and the doctors would be right in the center, so they could go. The doctors lived on the premises.
Wow. With
Yeah,
their families? Did they live with their families?
they had their whole families. In fact, in
Wow.
researching the book, I met many people who grew up, many people our age who grew up in these state hospitals because they were the children of doctors.
Did
Yeah.
it work? Did the treatment work?
Well, it worked. I mean, we can say it worked, and the numbers they quote are very impressive. They would say it worked sort of half the time. But
Okay.
but we have to remember a couple of things about that. First of all, a lot of the patients who went were not. There was a bigger spectrum of patients who went. Now, some people who would have then maybe gone for a stay in an asylum would be treated outpatient. They'd go to
Oh,
therapy,
right.
and of course, we didn't have the serotonin uptake drugs.
Right.
There are lots of ways in which probably the wellest patients that they had would not now go into institutions. but they did have some success nonetheless. And there are success stories now in treating mental illness. It's just that they're not um, the majority and not what we.
Right, right. There's a whole conversation in this novel that I also found totally fascinating with all the siblings about what art does, what it should do. And, at one point, Lena is obsessed with, she wants a life in art, but she's wondering, is art useful? And I thought that was such an interesting question, especially now where people think, well, any sort of art is, elitist in a way. Should art do more? Should it have a practical purpose? And why isn't just emotionally impacting a person something that's useful? And that went on to like, who should be paid more? Janitors, surgeons, or artists? And should people who loved what they did for a living be paid less because they received no material compensation? I thought this was like an incredibly interesting thing to think about. And all of these siblings think about that. So I was wondering like what you thought about that. And you could talk about that a little bit. I mean, I think I think useful is a very strange word to use with art. And I loved it that that word was used in the conversation.
Well, they're questioning their two of them at least have a real affinity for some kind of art. Walter really wanted to love to design buildings, or that was his passion, was to design cities or buildings, and Lena wants to make more more abstract art. But in any case, they were both attracted to it, and of course, for them, it's kind of a tricky thing to do because, among other things, art is not very remunerative or very secure. So they're entering adulthood the way a lot of my students who are, say, first generation are. They both love this thing, but at the same time, they want to make a living. They know what it's like
Right,
to
right,
not make a living. So there's useful in the most.
right.
But what they were also talking about is, there are certain kinds of work where you go home at the end of the day and you've made life a little better for some people. And,
Right.
there are some things you can do that are kind of undeniably good. I think being an excellent second grade teacher is undeniably good and must be
And useful.
very useful and very satisfying. And medicine is like that, and nursing is like that. There are thousands, many, many professions that are like that. Um, and so they're really questioning whether it's worth it to be, how they can fit themselves into this, how they can both, and of course, young artists are never sure whether they'll. Very few of us would argue very long about whether Alice Munro or Shakespeare or, I don't know, name your five favorite authors, George Eliot. Very few people would argue about whether their work has done a lot of good for humanity. Certainly it has. But most 21-year-olds who hope to be writers or artists or architects or musicians or, anything like involving the aesthetics doesn't have the confidence or the certainty that they will become
Right, right,
one of the greats who's good enough to make
right.
that kind of difference.
But isn't there also a degree to do that? I mean, I have a lot of writer friends, and all of us also teach because that's our steady paycheck we know we'll always get. And yet it's on the periphery. It's something to do, and it is something that's useful. So maybe the answer to that is sort of finding pathways so you can do what you love and do something that will help you make a living.
And I'm a believer too that not all, I mean, I don't really believe in the great man, sort of theory of art either, that there was Shakespeare and that no one else during his time mattered. I think that all the people, in a way, all the people who were writing at that time created Shakespeare, and there's a name on it, but who cares really whose name is on it? I mean,
Right.
I think that everybody who's doing the work in a particular time matters and affects the whole web of what's being thought about and constructed.
So let's move on from art to love. Both Lena and Walter struggle with love. And, Walter feels his great love was not Susan, the woman he was with, but she's his real love. And Lena has a lot of discussion about who's her great love, like who is it. So I wanted to ask you, do you feel that there is a difference, you yourself, between great love and a real love? And if so, what is it? And can it change? Can it morph back from one to the other?
I think there's all kinds of, I think, there's all kinds of sexuality, there's all kinds of love. I think that it's a vast spectrum of excitability and limerence and, Janet Malcolm would say projection. Someone else would say sparkle. There's a great variety of it, and what we each need depends on who we are and where our poles are, as the kids say now. What your damage is. I mean, I think for Walter, his great love is Susan because he can live with her and they can
That's
live
right.
together. I don't think that the woman he kind of constantly, the woman he had a crush on for years, I think had too many of the same needs he did, and they probably couldn't fulfill them for each other. The only
Right.
kid who's lucky enough, the only one of these kids who's lucky enough, I mean, I think we all would love to have the luckiest people are those who fall madly in love and can live with that person happily ever after. That's not necessarily the most common occurrence, but
Right.
Donnie gets that. Donnie is lucky that way.
Donnie was a surprise to me in that the beginning of the way the novel's structured, which I really admired, was you start with Walter and we're living Walter's life along with him. Then we're living Lena's life, and we hear very little about Donnie. And then all of a sudden the book expands and we're in Donnie's head, and he actually became my favorite character. I just loved him because he had such a difficult time at first, and yet he opened up and he expanded. So I just wanted to ask, in terms of structure, was that always your plan, that you would go from Walter to Lena to
No,
Donnie, or did it surprise you?
it kind of surprised me, and I kept trying to, see if it should be more even, because the tendency is to want symmetry. But then I realized that I think it was sort of meant to be the way it was, because I think that each one, I mean, they're each really responding in a way to their mother and her situation. So Walter is dealing with the most, wild years of that, when everything changes. And Lena comes to terms with her mother later. And Donnie's the one who sort of accepts their mother in her new life and has a relationship with her there. So to
I
speak.
know, I loved that. So if we were to visit these characters, say 6 months from now, would they be, what are they doing? Are they okay?
I think they're okay. I think they're doing pretty much what they were doing. I think,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, and I have a writerly question for you.
Sure.
Do you feel that one of your novels is shaped on what you've done with the novel before? Like, do you feel like you learned certain lessons in writing Anywhere But Here, and you could put that onto The Lost Father? Do you feel,
Great.
that you build on it, or is it always a surprise for
That's
you?
a great question. No, I feel like every novel is its own kind of mountain, and I'm at the very bottom every time. I wish I felt I learned from it. It's kind of different challenges to me. But I would like that. I would like to learn from every novel.
Yeah, I think we all want to have that, but it's always really hard when you're in the novel and it has its own challenges. So do you have an idea of what you're writing about before you start writing? Or do you just, do you outline? Do you hate outlining?
Start with little scraps and sort of
Okay.
notes, and I'll usually have a bunch of little scraps of notes, and many of them, sometimes even the ones that seem like, oh, that's a great idea, just never amount to anything. Um,
What was the scrap for commitment?
I think I really did start with Walter. I think I I like the idea of a kid. Maybe this comes a little bit out of teaching. because there's something about college which seems such a leveling experience. You know, everybody has a dorm room, everybody goes to classes, everybody's wearing jeans, everybody's, you know, it seems everybody's life is leveled in a way, and yet, of course, that's not true at all. And I like to think of this young man who's starting apparently like everyone else and experiencing some of the usual excitements, you know, an exhilarating sense of new friendships and falling in love with with the pair of girls down the hall, one a little more than the other, one he pictures naked at night, the other is more of a friend. But, you know, discovering his passion for what he does and liking that class. But at the same time, he's got real concerns that are of a much graver nature. He's really worried about his mother and will she be able to manage back at home without him. And meanwhile, he finds out he's experiencing all these typical college excitements. And then one day he goes to his mailbox, opens it, and finds a bill from the college and sees that no one has been paying his dorm and meal fees. And that's one crisis, and things get worse from there on for him.
You said in an interview that it took you 6 years to write Commitment with Many Ideas on the Floor. I think that's always a really important thing for a writer to say, because I have so many students who believe that they're going to write a first draft of a novel in 8 months and that's going to be it. It's going to be done. So I want to know, is that always your process, that it takes 6 years? And can you tell us one of the ideas that you left on the floor? I'd love to know.
I'm not sure I remember too many of the ideas I left on the floor, but I will say that I know I don't think it works that way every time. And we have to remember Gatsby was written in a few months, and there are, you know, many masterpieces that were written fairly quickly. And even for me, I've had sort of faster novels. Off Keck Road was fairly quick for me. What the last couple of years of working on Commitment, I started working on something else, which I discovered, which I worked on earlier and gotten to a certain point and couldn't do any more with it. And then I realized it was sort of a half of something, and I've been working on the other half. So I have another book I almost feel like sometimes there's a hard book and then you're rewarded by a slightly easier one, if that makes sense. But
it does. You said you were a class clown in elementary school. Do you still have that clown in you?
I don't think as much. I would like to.
I also wanted to know, once you're on the same subject, what's it like to have been a Simpson character?
I was going to say I'm probably not the class clown anymore because in my early 30s, I married an extremely talented comedy writer. So, you know, and then my two children also have brilliant senses of humor. So I've been the least funny person in the room for a long time.
That's really funny. I want to talk about the cover of Commitment. I couldn't find my copy of the book, which is somewhere in my office, but it is an absolutely beautiful cover. It's all the family.
Too. I love it.
It looks like it's almost sun-baked, and it almost looks like it's sun-baked and it's a little too hot, and there's no cool water to appease that. It just sets up this extraordinary mood. Did you have input into the cover, or did you just see it and say, I love this, this is perfect?
I definitely had input in the covers that came before this cover. They also ended up on the floor.
That's always terrible when that happens, isn't it?
Like the ideas that didn't make it in, there were covers that didn't make it in. But yes, this one was really amazing.
I also wanted to talk about the details, which were of the 70s, which were so much fun. I loved when at one point Walter is listening to play that funky music, White Boy, which was poundingly played every single minute during this time. And there's all these other kinds of just great details where I would stop and have a flash of recognition. So did you do research, or is this a lot of stuff from memory? Or
I did the simplest of research for that sort of thing. I would sort of look at what were the most played songs. In middle school and high school, I worked in an ice cream store, and I closed up at night often. So I would hear the top 10, songs again and again. So they all came back to me. It was fun.
Okay, we have a bunch of questions, but I have to ask. There's one question I always ask writers because I always want to know, because I'm an obsessive person. What's obsessing you now and why?
That's a good question. I think my next book is the first book in which I've really addressed sexuality, and we live in a time when we're talking about all kinds of sexual and gender issues, and
Right.
I think there's so much complication even in the most sort of boring, even in the most boring people, one might say. There's so much complex sexuality, and I think gender is really a made up thing in lots of ways for everyone, not only for people who have gender dysmorphia, for everyone. I think it's such a spectrum. And I want to write. I'm writing a little bit about that, or thinking a little bit about that.
Okay, we have some questions. Whoops, I just lost them. I'm sorry.
I see one.
You do? Can you read it out loud? Because I just lost them. Or Ollie, can you put a question? Oh, here we are. What pieces of yourself or your life can you see in the characters of this story?
Oh, there's lots of little pieces all over the place. Walter, it's funny because when I was younger, I did find it harder to write male characters than female. But now, with the benefit of a few decades, it's just as a young man is as poignant to me as a young woman, and I find them just as easy to enter. So I gave at Berkeley. I went to Berkeley as an undergraduate. I loved Berkeley the way Walter loves Berkeley. I gave a lot of the Berkeley stuff to Walter. Then I'm sure I had a lot of the feeling in awe of my mother, but not wanting to be my mother that Nina has. And then I have a little of Donnie too, but I'm not sure that I've just sprinkled details throughout. There's always little bits of things that turn up.
Okay. We have another audience question, which is about you being a poet. How did you start off with poetry rather than fiction? And when was the why now moment when you decided, you know what, I really want to write a novel. I need to be more expressive.
Well, I think I started with stories before novels, but I don't know. Maybe it was a big mistake. I think it's harder really to be a poet than it is to be a fiction writer. It's kind of all the most intense, ecstatic, momentous moment, whereas fiction writers deal with time a lot. So you can, I think fiction is sort of an amalgam of poetry and maybe journalism. So I still love to read poetry. So I think, in my next life, I'd like to be a poet.
I want to ask you, if you weren't a writer, what would you be? I'm sorry, that sounds like what kind of tree would you like to be? But truthfully, what else would you like to do?
Oh, if you
weren't a writer, if you were not a writer.
Not that I'd be necessarily very good at them, but I had originally, when I first went to college, like Walter toys with the idea, I had wanted to be a doctor, and I'd even trained in pre-medicine. And I still think that's a very great thing to do. I mean, I love the idea of doing something where you would come home at night and it definitely helped X number of people.
Right.
That seems like it must be a very satisfying life. And I actually now live with the doctor, so I actually see that in action. He gets calls from some of his elderly patients when they go to the hospital or something. And it seems like a good life to me.
It must also seem, though, that you do get stuff from fans or from people who tell you how much your work meant to them also. So you do know that you have that impact, which is very, very great. I wanted to ask you, there was another group.
I would say that writers, I don't know that writers have impact in that way. I don't know that they do, because I think even there's a wonderful Tobias Wolff story that um, I don't know if I'm sure you've read it, Carolyn, but I'm not sure all your readers have. If they haven't, it's a wonderful story called um, "In the Garden of the North American Martyrs," and it's a story about a professor who who's an English professor. So and there's a kind of a schmaltzy poet, a poet that writes about daisies and sheep and just the corniest stuff. And he goes to a conference and meets a woman and somehow ends up in bed with her. And she takes off her wig. She doesn't actually want to sleep with her. He's married. He doesn't want to do this. But then she says, before anything happens, I have to do this. And she takes off her wig and she's bald from chemotherapy. And then he thinks he has to go through this, or she'll feel that it was that repels him. And what he learns after a while, what she tells him, is that what made her want to live through all the painful treatments for her cancer was this schmaltzy poet. So you never know. I mean, it's hard to know what work is going to impact life.
I have another question, where it's another line that I wrote down, which was, cancer infects cells, madness infects love. I thought that was really profound, and I wonder if you could say a few words about that.
Well, I think mental illness can make people, turn against even the people they love, and that can be very hard. It's one thing to say that your parent is suffering from cancer, but that doesn't mean that they stop treating you the way they always treated you, and it doesn't mean that your relationship to them changes. But if your parent becomes mentally ill, your relationship with them does sometimes change.
Yeah, and I think it especially changes too, because with cancer, a lot of times there is a cure. With madness, it can, as we saw with Diane, that was her whole life. That was her whole life, and that's a huge burden.
But it's not certain. It's not for everything.
Right. Although you said there was another question. Can you tell us about the importance of looking backwards on eugenics as a scar that we may or may not have healed from?
Oh, that's really interesting. There's a friend of mine, a novelist, Michelle Hunneman, who's writing about one of the founders of eugenics, named George Papineau, who also happens to be the guy who started marriage counseling. I don't know what that means, but I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't know that we've recovered from the scar of eugenics, because we still have, a lot of racial trouble in our country that I'm not sure we've confronted fully enough.
I have one more question, but first I want to tell everybody out there, please buy all of Mona's books at bookshop.org, which supports independent bookstores, or you can just walk down to your favorite independent bookstore and spend your money there. That's what we like to do. So my last question is, since you teach, what's the best advice that you would give to any young writers out there? And what's the worst advice you think they should ignore?
That's a good question, especially the worst advice question.
There's a lot of worst advice.
Really, that's funny. That's a hard question. I think the best advice, I think, is always just really to write. I mean, just to write every day, as much as possible. Begin a practice of doing it every day, so that you'll know, just like you have any other habit. If you run every day or something, it becomes easier and easier. It's sort of to do it all the time, and once you're writing all the time. I had two teachers in college, one of whom was sort of a brilliant close reader, and he would take all our stories and would read one line and he would say to the class, "What's wrong with that?" And we became sort of brilliant critics. We would hear rhythmic inaccuracies, and we were surgeons of the cliche. But then after he read the one sentence that we identified the faults of, he would throw it on the floor and go to the next one. If you got through a paragraph, you'd feel great. And in fact, we all really, it trained our ears phenomenally. But we all stopped writing by sort of halfway through the quarter. I had another teacher who would say, "That's great. You're going to save the short story. Write some more." And you'd feel great until you realized that he said that to more or less everyone. But everyone was writing a lot, and miraculously, people did improve. So I mean, I think you will solve your own problems by writing if you keep at it.
I
Um,
think so too. And reading a lot and paying attention to what you read also.
for sure. What would bad advice be? I'm not sure.
I think bad advice is write to the market. Look to
Yeah,
see what's best selling and write something like that. I mean, I think that's really bad advice.
I think
Um,
it's who could predict.
yeah,
Mhm.
I mean, I don't know what else. There's been a whole lot of bad advice thrown around there, but I think that is the worst, where people study the market instead of studying books that they're reading and that kind of stuff. Okay, so I want to thank everybody who is out here who came to hear this. This is going to be recorded, so you can tell your friends. You can watch this again it'll be on our YouTube, the Mighty Blaze YouTube station. So you can watch it as many times as you want. Again, please go to your local indie bookstore. Before I say my final goodbye, Mona, just stay on for a little bit so we can thank you privately. And
Sure.
everybody else, we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.